A software engineer, hardware engineer, and departmental manager were on their way to a meeting in Switzerland. They were driving down a steep mountain road when suddenly the brakes failed. The car careened out of control, bouncing off guardrails until it miraculously ground to a scraping halt along the mountainside. The occupants of the car were unhurt, but they had a problem. They were stuck halfway down the mountain in a car with no brakes. "I know," said the manager. "Let's have a meeting, propose a vision, formulate a mission statement, define some goals statement, and through a process of continuous improvement, find a solution to the critical problems, and we'll be on our way." "No," said the hardware engineer. "I've got my Swiss Army knife with me. I can strip down the car's braking system, isolate the fault, fix it, and we'll be on our way." "Wait," said the software engineer. "Before we do anything, shouldn't we push the car back to the top of the mountain and see if it happens again?" One day, I looked at my wife and said, "Honey, 25 years ago, we had a cheap apartment, a cheap car, slept on a sofa bed, and watched a 10-inch black and white TV, but I got to sleep every night with a hot 25-year-old blonde. Now we have a nice house, a nice car, a big bed, and a plasma screen TV, but I'm sleeping with a 50-year-old woman. It seems to me that you are not holding up your side of things." My wife is a very reasonable woman. She told me to go out and find a hot 25-year-old blonde, and she would make sure that I would once again be living in a cheap apartment, driving a cheap car, sleeping on a sofa bed. 2. A sweet old lady is making lunch for her husband one day. She had been making him the same lunch for the past 40 years, his favorite, a sandwich on Italian bread made with turkey, American cheese, pickles, onions, mustard, and mayo. The husband walks into the kitchen, sits down, and takes a bite. His wife asks the same thing she always asks, "How's the sandwich, dear?" Every time he would give the same response, "It tastes fine." He would continue eating with a disappointed look on his face. His wife thinks maybe it's time to switch things up a bit. So the next day, she makes him his normal lunch, only this time she makes it with ham and cheese and on wheat bread. She thought surely he would enjoy this. The husband enters the kitchen, sits down, and takes a bite. His wife then asks, "How's the sandwich, dear?" As always, he replies, "It tastes fine." He would continue eating with a disappointed look on his face. His wife then thinks maybe she needs to offer him more variety. So the next day she makes him a sandwich, only this time it's made with salami, pepperoni, and extra veggies, and vinaigrette dressing. He walks in the kitchen, takes a bite, and the wife asks, "How's the sandwich, dear?" As always, he replied, "It tastes fine," and continued eating with a disappointed look on his face. The next day, as lunchtime was getting ready to roll around, his wife was making him lunch. She was furious at the lack of excitement and enjoyment coming from her husband, so she decided she was going to make him the most unique sandwich he had ever had. She prepares her Italian bread, only this time she toasts it and almost burns it. She adds random ingredients like peanut butter, peppers and onions, strawberry jam, turkey, ham, corned beef, some olives, and some various seasonings. She thought, "If this doesn't get a new reaction out of him, nothing will." The husband walks into the kitchen, takes a seat, and takes a bite of his sandwich. All of a sudden, his eyes widen, and he takes 2 more bites. Suddenly, he looks up at his wife with the biggest grin he's ever had. He chuckled a bit and said, "Finally, something original in this sub." 3. There was once a woman who had 100 children. She was a bit of an eccentric. You'd have to be to have 100 kids after all. And so she decided to give her children names after the order they were born in. So she had 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through to 100. Her husband was eventually unable to keep up with the pressure of having a family this absurdly big. So he ran out one day, leaving the woman to raise her kids alone. For a while, she managed. and they were a loving family. But one evening, someone got careless and left the gas stove on. The house caught fire and everyone died. All of them except the girl 90, who alone was left of her entire family. 90 lived traumatized for a while. How could she not? Her father had run out and never came back looking for her even after news of what had happened must have surely reached him. And her entire family had died. She was alone in the world. But years passed, and time heals all wounds. Eventually, one day she found a man she loved, and she married him. She had kids of her own, though presumably because she valued her own mental and physical health, and because she didn't want to repeat the mistakes her own parents had made, she just had 3 kids, 2 girls, and a boy. It was a lovely family, and they all trusted each other immensely. Though there was one exception, 90 was adamant that their family would never grow beyond this. She said no to having any more kids. She even said no to having pets. One day, 90's kids found an injured puppy in the park on the other side of town. He looked very badly hurt, and they couldn't bring themselves to leave him there, so they decided to bring him back home, where they hoped to nurse him back to health and maybe even keep him. But they knew that, at least at first, they would have to keep him and his very existence secret. So they kept him in the basement and decided to give him an innocuous name so that they could talk about him even around their parents without them knowing they were referring to a puppy. So they decided to call him This. That way, they could talk about him without getting caught. Weeks passed, and This was recovered. The kids really grew to love him. He was such a playful puppy, and he added so much joy to their lives. They decided the time had come to finally come clean to their parents about him, and they were excited. They went down to the basement to get him, but when they got there, they realized something horrible. Somehow, This had escaped. He was nowhere. They put their plan to tell their parents on hold and went looking for him, but no matter how much they searched, they never found him. They never saw This again. No one else knew about This. No one even knew a dog named This existed. Only 90's kids will remember This. 4. One day, Stalin decides to go to the cinema in disguise and hear what people are really saying about him. When the newsreel comes on, the audience stands up and applauds each time he appears on the screen. Stalin is pleased. Modestly, he himself remains seated. After a few moments, the man next to him leans over and whispers, "Most people feel the same way you do, comrade, but you'll be safer if you stand up." 5. A woman is in a coma, and the nurse tending to her notices that whenever she is sponge bathing the woman's vital signs jump a little on all of the machines and screens. So the nurse calls the husband and says, "Come down to the hospital. I think I know how to get your wife out of this coma." So the husband hurries down and asks the nurse what he can do. The nurse says, "I think that oral sex will bring her out of her coma. It will arouse her enough to bring her out of the coma." So the nurse closes the curtains and leaves the husband with his wife in the room. Moments later, the man comes running out of the room, flustered. The nurse, worried, asks him what happened. The husband says, "I don't know. I think that she started choking." 6. When my wife died, my entire world shattered. You have a plan in your mind for your whole life, and then one day it's just gone, leaving you adrift. One day my best friend was gone, the woman I shared half my soul with. I could barely keep it together. I hate to admit, but I was useless in setting up the funeral. Her family did that, while mine mostly just made everything worse, like they always do. I was crying so hard I could barely see, faces blurred like ripples in a stream. When the time came to walk past her casket and pay my respects, my grief seemed to ease, like I was coming up for air, like this was all suddenly real in this moment when it hadn't been before. And I stood there, looking down at her, at this wax effigy that was once the most important person in the world to me, and I thought, I wonder how many walnuts I could put in her mouth before anyone noticed. 7. A software developer dies and comes to the pearly gates. St. Peter looks at the screen of his PC and says, "Sorry, I cannot let you in. There are bugs in the enrollment system, and since you are a software developer, you must fix them first." So the software developer takes a seat at St. Peter's desk and tries to fix the bugs for hours and hours, but without any success. Totally frustrated, he finally slams the keyboard into the screen. "You may enter now," says St. Peter. "It just turned into a hardware problem.